Good evening. It's 7:02 on on Tuesday, May 24th, 2022, and I want to welcome everybody to the Burlingame Historical Society for our spring 2022 Historical Society quarterly presentation. Tonight, we're going to feature former two-time mayor of Hillsborough and multi-year school board member Paul Regan. This program is being graciously hosted on Zoom by the Burlingame Public Library. And in particular, I'd like to thank the brilliant Jason Yap, who is going to be at our Zoom controls this evening to keep us all on track. So our guest this evening is Paul Regan, as I mentioned. So in addition to his many community pursuits, Paul Regan was one of the founders of forensic accounting, and he's recently published his first book entitled The Forensic. So tonight we're going to learn all about how a nondescript San Mateo office building actually became ground zero for a multi-year battle against the ever-elusive Howard Hughes. And I want to thank Paul very much for helping us tonight, and in particular for competing against the Warriors this evening.
Oh, yeah, right.
I'd like to say also that we are going to record this meeting, so I want everybody to know if they don't want to be recorded, maybe they need to just be muted, because we would like to post this on our website and probably the Burlingame Library's website, whatever they want, after the evening is done, so that people who missed it or are watching the Warriors can actually enjoy it at a later time. So thank you very much, Paul. And with that, I'll let you take over and maybe explain the format you would like to use this evening.
Well, I'm going to share my screen, which is got a PowerPoint presentation. And we're going to start the show from the beginning. All right. One thing you'll notice is behind my name, most people know what CPA means, but after that, there's something called CFF, and that is the AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants designation of that I have become a certified in financial forensics. That's a specialization within the CPA practice. And that's basically all I do, and it's all I have done for many years. I don't do audits and I don't do taxes, or I don't any longer do audits and taxes, and haven't for the past more than 20 years. So what we're going to be focusing on tonight is a book that I wrote, which is called The Forensic, and it's about how the CIA, a brilliant attorney and a young CPA, brought down Howard Hughes. Let me give you a definition of forensic, which is the AICPA's definition, which I participated in writing. But it's basically an application of specialized knowledge and investigative skills to collect, to analyze, and evaluate evidential matter, and to interpret and communicate findings in the courtroom or other legal or administrative venue. Now, I want to explain why I wrote The Forensic. The lead attorney in the litigation against Howard Hughes was John Clark. He died in the summer of 2019. And I went to his service in Aspen, Colorado, and traveled with a number of attorneys that worked with John. And they suggested many times that I write a book about my experience on the Air West case against Howard Hughes. So I decided I would do that, and I dedicated the book to him. And one of the things I liked about John is he always had the same message for each of his witnesses in the more than 50 cases that I worked with him. So before the witnesses would testify, he would remind them, your job is to listen to the question and tell the truth. My job, that being John's job as an attorney, is to work with the truth. And I really love that about John. And you might think that that instruction is something which very few attorneys give witnesses. And I think we see a lot of that on TV and coverage of high-profile litigation. He was a man of great integrity, passion, energy, and brilliance. Now, speaking of his energy and passion, this is John here in the 1970s. He was a graduate, he was a guard on both ways, offense and defense, on Stanford's football team and played with John Brody. He had an undergraduate in engineering. There's a dog across the street that's making a lot of noise. I'm sorry. And it was my pleasure to work with him on more than 50 cases over 40 years, all in the United States. So, and what happened in the Air West case is it went on, my effort went on for 7 years. It was litigated for 5 years, and it got a lot of public attention, and it basically moved me from the audit world to the world of forensics. And since that time, I've testified in more than 125 trials, given more than 230 depositions. The longest would have been for 20 days. I've done a couple for 20 days, several for 15 days. And I've testified in the United States, Australia, Canada, England, the World Court in the United States dispute against the Islamic Republic of Iran following the seizure of US assets in the 1979 revolution. Also testified in Guam. I testified in that case for 6 weeks. And then after we obtained a fraud verdict, I testified for 2 weeks on punitive damages. These are the states I've testified in. I think there's 23 states. And I put them on a map. You can see them. I certainly testified in many times in California, many times in Texas, many times in Florida, and also Washington, D.C. and New York. The midsection of the country, not a lot of testimony. There's not a lot of great big litigation, civil litigation in the center of the country. I do a lot of work and testimony for the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FDIC, the Department of Justice, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae. These are usually banking frauds where the United States as an insurer has been damaged by fraudulent financial activity within the banking system. And I've testified for 23 different attorneys general around the United States. I also testify for corporations that are involved typically in disputes with other corporations. So just to give you a sense, some of the people that I've worked against, of course, Howard Hughes. When the Hughes case ended, the SEC asked me to investigate Michael Milken's trading activity in the bond market, which led to a $400 million settlement by Michael. British government asked me to investigate John DeLorean with respect to the DMC-12, which is the Back to the Future car. I testified in the Enron case for 3 days. Countrywide Financial against Anthony Mazzella, who's was named one of the 20 most responsible people for the Great Recession, starting in 2008. And one of his compatriots, Richard Fuld at Lehman Brothers, he pretty much was #1 on the Great Recession list. It was a $50 billion repo, what they call it, a repo 105 fraud. He was trying to package a $60 billion fraud, and the counterparties in Europe pulled the plug, and they filed for bankruptcy on September 15, 2008, which set off a worldwide economic recession. Most people know about Bernie Madoff. My testimony there was about the back office operations and others who participated in the fraud, because Bernie pled guilty and he was sent to jail. Chainsaw Al Dunlap, Chainsaw is a wonderful name for Chainsaw Al. The Parmalat case was a $15 billion fraud. It was in Italy. Bill Gates, that was a case for the Department of Justice in connection with unfair business practices in his early days with respect to some of his anti-competitive behavior. Mickey Mouse, and of course Larry Ellison. We all know Larry in the area. I've worked on a couple of cases against Larry. Now, what's the focus of the forensic? Howard Hughes acquired 100% of the shares of Air West, which was here in San Mateo. And I'll show you the pictures of their buildings in San Mateo in a few minutes. Shareholders voted to approve the acquisition in December. Actually, it was December 31, 1968. They had their meeting at the Thunderbolt Hotel, which you probably remember. It is now in a loft hotel. It was a Westin for a long time. Or no, excuse me, Westin is behind it. It's the 101 and Millbrae Avenue. But Hughes wanted to delay the closing until March 31, 1970. And that was part of his fraud scheme. I was at Piedmont Mitchell, which is now KPMG, in the audit side. And I worked on both the merger accounting as well as the 1968. And I was in charge of the 1969 audit. But while I was doing the 1970 tax return of AW Liquidating Company, which is the successor to Air West, it received the proceeds from Howard Hughes into AW Liquidating Company for the distribution to its shareholders. So I was working on the tax return at the Air West facilities, and I discovered a massive fraud, which lowered the purchase price of the airline to Howard Hughes. And the litigation went on from 1970 to 1975. Howard and his attorney, Chester Davis, they tended to get in a lot of litigation, and they tended to have kind of a scorched earth litigation policy that their litigation tended to last a long time. The basic issue was that Howard was to pay $22 a share for each share of Air West. But if Air West net worth fell below a certain dollar amount, the purchase price would be reduced dollar for dollar, or Hughes could walk from the transaction. The net worth was to be calculated in accordance with GAAP, that's generally accepted accounting principles, consistent with the airline's July 31, 1968 financial statements. So this net worth requirement presented Hughes with an opportunity to reduce the purchase price by millions of dollars. Howard generally always took advantage of those kinds of opportunities. So he took this opportunity immediately. Now, the problem with Howard is, like many people that I work against, Bernie Madoff, Chainsaw Al Dunlap, Richard Fuld, that cast of characters, Howard, like them, they had no empathy for anybody else. They demanded unquestioned loyalty, and his need for success drove his actions and those working for him. He pursued victory at all costs in his litigation. And he had his own Roy Cohn on his side, and that was his belligerent, obnoxious, aggressive, and very nasty lawyer, Chester Davis. A little background about Howard. He was a big fellow. He was 6'4" tall. This is a picture of him standing next to an airplane he invented. And he took that airplane and set a speed record on his fourth pass in the course that established that record. Then he crashed that airplane right after that. He's setting that record because he ran out of gas. He was not hurt in the crash. He crashed, I think, in a cornfield. He was a very bright guy, multi-talented, and he was basically the Elon Musk of his time. He had a lot of multi-skills, a bright man, and very adventuresome. So he used two schemes to reduce the purchase price of Air West. He immediately, after launching an effort to acquire the airline, he launched a media campaign which borrowed the words Air Worst. And he used this media campaign to attack Air West's revenue and to increase its costs. That would drive down its assets, increase its liabilities, and therefore reduce the net worth and the purchase price of the airline to him. Now, what molded Howard's flawed character? Howard was an only child. His mom died when he was 16. She had recently gotten pregnant. She was shopping, and she began to hemorrhage. I went to the hospital and died. His dad, Howard Sr., founded Hughes Tool Company with a partner in 1924. He died in he founded Hughes Tool Company, but in 1924, when Howard was 18, Howard Sr. died. Howard was attending Rice University at the time. He dropped out immediately to take over Hughes Tool, which had been an incredible success, and I'll explain that in a minute. But Howard quickly wanted to own 100% of the tool company. And the other 25% owners were his uncle and his grandparents. Now, this was a company that was making millions of dollars a month. He bought out his grandparents for the payment of $10, and their shares were worth millions. That gives you a flavor for Howard's behavior. What made tool companies so successful? This was the drill that Howard Sr. invented. It spun, and these cones also spun, they rotated, and each nodule had a place for oil to come out. And it would penetrate the rock barrier that covered the Texas oil fields. Drilled 6 times faster than its competitor, and it could go thousands of feet deep, many more feet than the competitors. Howard Sr. said, hey, I got the patents on this. I'm not going to sell this tool. You're going to have to license it from me. And he basically controlled the worldwide market of oil drilling through his leases, which brought in millions and millions a month to his dad and then Howard. But in the year after his dad died, Howard's mother and Ella Rice's mother arranged for Howard and Ella to be married. She was a homecoming queen. She provided Howard's stature in Texas and gained an entry into Texas society. Rice University is named after her family. She was a very prominent family. Give you a sense of Howard was invited one acquaintance to the wedding. Ella invited hundreds of guests. And you can again see there's a real height disparity because Howard's 6'4". So immediately after that, Howard didn't want to be bogged down in running Hughes Tool Company. So he hired a brilliant CPA from Haskins and Sells, which is now Deloitte, to run Toolco while Howard went to Hollywood to make movies. And he made some really good movies. He made 29 in all. You'll see that a lot of the cast was very famous. His first movie was Hell's Angels with Jean Harlow. Scarface with George Raft and Boris Karloff. The Outlaw was a very famous movie with Jane Russell. And he also had Susan Hayward, John Wayne, Janet Leigh, Robert Mitchum, Victor Mature, Spencer Tracy, a lot of real A-listers. So he produced these and directed them. It was very successful. Hell's Angels was his first movie. It was a World War I thriller. You'll see a biplane down here. There were biplanes. There's another biplane here. Howard flew one of the biplanes and did filming from the biplane. And he worked 24 hours a day and sometimes 36 hours. During a flight over the set, he crashed a plane that left a piece of metal in his skull, which was never removed. And he, from then on, had a continuous bout of headaches and bizarre behavior, which got worse later as the years progressed. Another movie that I mentioned, The Outlaw. Howard got in trouble with the censors when they say here the picture that couldn't be stopped. That was because Howard persisted in litigation against the Hollywood movie censors who would not approve the release of the picture. There was eventually a compromise. The issue was over the display of cleavage by Jane Russell in the movie. He supposedly invented the brassiere, which allowed for emphasis on the brassiere, but Jane Russell later wrote that Howard was proud of his brassiere, but she felt it was not comfortable and she used her own. So that's a little trivia piece. So he also designed and flew a lot of aircraft that set many speed records and also distance records. He was the fastest, he flew the fastest around the world at his time, and they had a ticker tape parade down in New York where millions were in attendance. He also owned and sold Trans World Airlines. He started a large aircraft production company. This company is very successful. It continues to today. They launched satellites, invented night vision technology, launched, have many radar systems, and also design a lot of our flight and weapon systems for jet aircraft. And he bought 7 hotels and casinos in Las Vegas, plus a TV station, parts of McCarran Field, and other real estate. He also founded a large medical foundation, which again continues today. In 1966, he was reported to be the wealthiest man in the world. Now, he wanted to harvest Las Vegas, and he wanted to do that. He hired a guy named Robert Mayo, and he put Mayo in charge of building his Nevada operations. So Mayo was perfectly suited for this role, particularly in the mob-controlled Las Vegas. He graduated from Georgetown Law. During World War II, he worked very successfully misinformation campaigns in France. And he did cutout work for the FBI and the CIA. The cutout work is work where the FBI or the CIA don't want to be associated with the work, so they hired Mayhew to perform these activities, usually to try to compromise foreign dignitaries through use of drugs or prostitutes. But he also headed up the CIA's efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro. This wasn't made public until I think 2017. And that information was a bit of a surprise. And he hired two of his mob buddies that were in Florida, who had the biggest casinos in Cuba. And the CIA were offered to pay them $250,000, but they accepted the assignment for free, thinking that it was their patriotic duty to do this work. They came close on 3 different attempts, but they were never successful. Now, Mayhew's exploits are believed to be the basis for the Mission Impossible movies and TV series. He had extensive mob connections, and was very close to J. Edgar Hoover. In 1966, Mayhew moved Howard to the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. He never met Howard, and all of his communications were by memorandum and telephone. Now, in 1966, Paul Laxalt was running for governor. Laxalt and Hughes agreed that if Mayhew could appear as Hughes' surrogate before the Nevada Gaming Control Board and the Gaming Commission, Howard would make major contributions to his campaign and the campaigns of Laxalt's designees, and help drive out the mob before purchasing casinos in Las Vegas. Laxalt won. It was a pretty close election, but he won in early November. And then Mayhew went back to meet with J. Edgar Hoover to get his blessing and support of Howard's plan to buy casinos. And he got Hoover's approval. So he had the governor, he had the legislature, a lot of bribes that were paid. And he had J. Edgar Hoover to support his plan. So Howard moved on Thanksgiving Day of 1966 to the Desert Inn. Howard picked the Desert Inn because Howard was a movie freak. Obviously, he had a lot of success in movies, and he loved the movie Ocean's 11. And he thought, well, that was the good target for him. And also with the Sands, which was also in Ocean's 11. And we'll get to that in a minute. He also acquired the New Frontier, the Castaways, the Silver Slipper, and the Landmark. He bought a CBS station in KLAS and purchased a lot of land, including some of the land that McCarran Field was on. So in 1968, Howard wanted to return to aviation, and he found Air West, and his thought was he was going to take Air West and make a hub in Las Vegas, which would help feed his casinos and the land, and he would build housing for his employees and other newcomers in Las Vegas. This turned out to be very successful. Just to remind you, Ocean's 11, Howard probably watched this more than 100 times. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. I've got a picture of them here in a minute. Lots of A-list folks. Here's a picture of them at the Sands. They appeared at the Sands a great deal. This is the Rat Pack. And the Sands was owned by a crime boss named Myers Lansky, and I liked his nickname, which it was the mob's accountant, as well as Frank Costello, the so-called prime minister of the underworld. Mayhew wanted the Rat Pack at the Sands to take their success from Ocean's 11 and put them into the Sands Hotel. Howard didn't like Frank Sinatra because he didn't think that he treated Ava Gardner properly. And Howard was a racist and didn't care for Sammy Davis Jr. appearing in his casino, but he acquiesced to Mayhew. So in Air West, the Department of Justice prohibited Howard from acquiring more casinos. Air West began its operations on July 1, 1968, with a hub in Las Vegas. Air West was a merger of Bonanza Airlines, West Coast Airlines, which was in Seattle. Bonanza was headquartered in Phoenix, and Pacific, which was headquartered in San Francisco. So they came together on July 1, 1968, and immediately Howard and his media hammered Air West as unsafe and safety issues, performance issues, on-time issues, et cetera, to drive its revenues down. This is where their operations were. 181 2nd Avenue. Pictures that I took a couple months ago. My office during the merger accounting was here in this corner here. Dean Witter used to be down below here a long time ago. This was the third floor was at Air West revenue accounting. Revenue accounting for airlines is complicated because when an airline sells you a ticket, that represents cash to the airline, but not revenue. The only when you can record the revenue only when the passenger actually takes the flight, and that's a complicated collection of transactions, particularly if it involves multiple airlines, say a leg from New York to San Francisco and San Francisco to Bakersfield or Santa Barbara, New York, San Francisco on United, and then San Francisco to Bakersfield or Santa Barbara on Air West. That gets complicated. So they had this whole floor was revenue accounting. The executive offices were on the top floor. All the other accounting was on the 8th floor of 100 South Ellsworth. And our office was right there in that corner. It was a pretty sizable office. We often had 6 or 8 people in that office. And we had several people in the corner office at 181 South or 2nd Avenue. So in the purchase agreement allowed Haskins and Sells, which is now Deloitte, to access and copy the 1969 Pete Maurer working papers. Sadly, for trivia buffs, PMNM, which is Pete Maurer Mitchell, now known as KPMG. The PM is Pete Maurer, and the K is Kleinfeld, and the G is Gordner. Kleinfeld and Gordner were a big German firm, and they merged, and they decided, well, we're not going to call it Kleinfeld, Pete Maurer, Gordner. That's a big mouthful, so let's go with KPMG. So I kept a log of which of our documents were borrowed by H&S, when they were borrowed, at the date that they were returned to me. And this became important later in the litigation. And then when I returned to Hughes Air West, because the name of the airline was changed to Hughes Air West, to do the tax return, I discovered millions of accounting entries that were not consistent with the accounting practices called for by the purchase agreement. So I called the audit partner and asked him, well, what do you want me to do with this information? And he said, well, why don't you called General Counsel of Air West, whose name was Joe Martin. And Joe was, he said, I'm going to pick two of my strongest litigators. Why don't you have lunch with them, and you guys can figure out what to do next. Well, one of those two was John Clark, and I thought John was great right off the bat. He understood the issues. He was enthusiastic. He was obviously bright, and John and I hit it off big time from that lunch until he died in 2019. So what I learned during the pre-litigation investigation was that Howard, Mayhew, and Davis conducted a campaign of fear, uncertainty, and disruption, which we called a FUD campaign, which alleged and exploited poor service and safety issues. It caused massive losses that lowered the purchase price to Hughes. They also, in tandem with the FUD, they fiddled with the stock price of Air West by getting allies of Hughes to buy large blocks of shares and then sell them on the bad news that they created during the FUD. And then they would reimburse the allies with any losses they experienced. And then, of course, there were the bad transactions. So I want to describe the characters that we're dealing with, just to refresh your recollection. Davis, a ruthless and belligerent lawyer. He was very aggressive, never-ending lawsuits, never admitted anything contrary to his client's interest. He made a lot of payoffs. He was very heavily invested in his client's success. And I have this bullet here. I say use bullying and threatening taxes and perhaps violence. I say that perhaps violence because what I'm going to mention in a couple more slides. And we have Mr. Mission Impossible to deal with that I've described. Yeah, Hughes delayed the closing. He wanted to delay the closing because he was causing, in this FUD campaign, losses by the airline. So the longer it took him to close the purchase price, the more the losses were, and the cheaper the price of the airline would be. The other thing, and this is key, the March 31, 1970 financial statements would not be audited. This was a critical weakness for the shareholders because they had no protection against those late accounting entries that reduced Air West net worth through entries that violated the purchase price. Now, the Department of Justice was conducting its own criminal investigation, and they knew that I was working on the accounting adjustments. We were also identifying large blocks of trade, and we were investigating those large blocks of trade to see if they were timed with the FUD activities. And so I worked with the DOJ, and that led to their filing a criminal lawsuit against Howard, Chester, and Mayhew. And they had a grand jury proceeding. But the grand jury proceeding particularly was basically destroyed when their first two witnesses before the grand jury, confidential witness number 1, which is called CW by the DOJ, suffered a brain damage when he was struck by a fire axe the night before his testimony. And I say his testimony, I assume it was a man. And CW2, who disappeared. So they lost their key confidential witnesses, and the criminal case was dismissed. The criminal case would have carried long prison sentences for Howard, Mayhew, and Chester. So what do we have going for us? You know, we're dealing with the richest man in the world, a ruthless lawyer, Mr. Mission Impossible. By accident, there was a Russian submarine that fell to the ocean floor 3 miles below the surface, 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, killing all aboard. The CIA knew where the sub was, and the Russians didn't. Now, the reason the CIA knew where the sub was is because we had a practice of following Russian subs that left their base in the southeast portion of the Soviet Union, and we would follow those subs. And in this instance, the USS Swordfish was following K-129, this Russian sub. It was a nuclear sub, had nuclear missiles and nuclear torpedoes. And it used passive radar, which we had and the Soviets did not. Passive radar doesn't have a ping, and so the Russians didn't know that there was a sub behind it, and it could know its speed and its direction. And it got to where it got to 800 feet below the surface and continued and crashed. Subs at that time couldn't go below 800 feet. So the Swordfish knew exactly where this sub crashed. And the Russians did not. And that was a huge opportunity by the CIA. In addition, this is my second bullet here, Hughes fired Mayhew in late 1970. And the reason he fired him was Hughes had a misunderstanding of certain mining transactions, which were actually approved by someone else other than Mayhew. And Hughes was giving an interview, it was broadcast around the world, to denounce an author that said he had produced an unauthorized biography of Howard Hughes. And at the end, he was asked a question about, why did you fire Mayhew? And Mayhew gave a very nasty answer and told the world that Mayhew was dishonest and had stole him out of millions of dollars. Mayhew sued him, and it became a bitter lawsuit between Mayhew, Howard, and Chester. So turning Mayhew into an enemy was a very bad, it was very helpful to us. What happened to CW1 and 2 made the Department of Justice furious with Hughes and Chester, because they suspected that that one or both was the instigator for the disappearance and the brain damage of CW1 and CW2. And then the CIA had a falling out with Chester Davis and didn't trust him because this next bullet, they got a security guard had heard that Chester was going to send Project Azorian, which is the recovery of the Russian sub documents that were collected by Hughes' tool. He was going to send them to the Bahamas, and that would be against the agreement with the CIA. They did not want these highly confidential and sensitive documents to leave the country. They also got into a big argument with Chester over some of the pricing and repricing of work that Hughes had done on Project Azorian. So the security guard called, he also became aware that Mayhew and Chester and Howard were involved in this nasty litigation. So the security guard called Mayhew and said, they're going to send the Project Azorian documents to the Bahamas. And I've also heard that there are documents that relate to Air West. They're going to send those to the Bahamas as well. And those documents should have been produced to both the Department of Justice and to us, John and I, in the civil litigation. So the security guard, whose name was Mike Davis, in my book, I changed his name to Mike Jefferson because I didn't want another Davis in the book. And I thought Jefferson Davis, that makes sense. And the other thing that I had going for us, I had a great young team that was working with the great lawyer. So here's my team, young kids. And I was a young kid too. I was, 25 at the time. This is me here. And the key, I talk about them in my book. Tom Adler, young guy with the peace sign. I noticed that the peace sign with Tom, peace sign with Mary Kay Griffin, and peace sign with me. Tom later became a lawyer, and then he got his master's in tax, and he practices wealth management for wealthy, ironically, wealthy Texas and Oklahoma oil folks, kind of like Howard Hughes. Mary Kay became the first partner of a national CPA firm and was also chairman of the Utah Society of CPAs. So these Tom and Mary Kay were brilliant, and they worked so hard. There's a poster on the wall, and this is my office on the 8th floor of South Ellsworth. You can see the accounting ledgers on the desk. And I posted on the wall this article or a little ad that was in the Journal of Accountancy that says tiger or lamb, who makes the best CPA? And I think it's the tiger. So here's the 129. It had 3 nuclear missiles, 2 nuclear torpedoes. And this was the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Hughes, this ship, this enormous ship that was built from scratch for this operation, it had on the tail Hughes Glomar Explorer. Because the CIA wanted a cover for this operation because this ship was going to be sitting out 1,500 miles from Hawaii, and it needed a cover for why this was happening. And it was promoted that Howard Hughes was going to be mining magnesium nodules from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. So everybody bought into that because Howard Hughes did crazy things like today with Elon Musk. And these towers are seen here in this drawing. They lowered the so-called claw that was going to go down 3 miles, held up by 3 miles of piping from Hughes Tool Company. And the oil derrick was supporting the delivery of the claw to the bottom of the ocean. Hughes was not at risk for any of this. This is all paid for by the CIA. The claw was built by Lockheed, and it was built underneath the Hughes mining barge, the HMB-1 in Redwood City. And some of you may have seen that barge as it came in and out of the bay. It was an enormous vessel, and this claw was manufactured inside that barge, and then the barge took it to Santa Catalina, and it was a submersible, and then the Glomar Explorer went over the top of the barge and pulled the claw out. I got a drawing from the CIA archives, which the CIA gave me permission to put in the book. And you can see the stages of the recovery. Here's the lowering of the claw, and it's 3 miles down. And then the claw is grabbing, because you see the grabbers here. The claw is grabbing the sub. It leaves part of the claw on the floor, and it brings it up into the Glomar Explorer. That's actually what happened. One of the unfortunate things was that at I think it's 5,000 feet from the surface, a part of the sub broke off and fell to the floor. But there was recovery of the nuclear torpedoes and other documents. Also, the uncertainty of what we recovered was a cause of great concern to the Soviet Union. So when the security guard said that they were going to ship documents out of the United States, the CIA organized a break-in on June 6, 1974. It had been Hughes's motion picture studio. It's a nice building on 7,000 Romaine, which is in Hollywood. And the burglars were prepared because the security guard gave them all of the details about the kind of safe that was in place and the lock cabinets and where the boxes of documents were, including the box of Air West documents. So I won't explain this again, but they had been indicted in December of 1973. Of course, they got the problems with CW1 and 2. DOJ was extremely angry, case was dismissed. So the burglars were instructed by Mayhew to take both the Project Azarian documents and the box of Air West documents. He also told them, hey, if you can find any documents that say nice things about me, and any compromising information that I can use in my lawsuit against Howard and Chester, steal that too. What happened was the CIA brought all the boxes to Mayhew in Las Vegas after the burglary, and they sorted out the CIA Project Azarian documents, and those were delivered to the CIA in Washington. Mayhew had a box of documents that might be helpful to him. And then the Air West box, he sent to the Department of Justice. But the DOJ, when they got them, they looked at the documents and they were all accounting work papers. They were actually the copies of documents that that H&S had made and given to Hughes. So the DOJ said, well, our case is dismissed. What we're really interested in is the stock trading and the FUD. Why don't you send the Air West accounting documents to Paul Regan in San Mateo? My office at that time, my firm, was at 1700 South El Camino Real, which is across from the building that's now Chase and Burrell Square. And so one day I got this box. It was in plain brown paper. The only thing on it was stamps. There was no postage machine that would tell me who sent the box. And there were canceled stamps. I opened it up and lo and behold, it's copies of my work papers. But the key was, on those working papers were handwritten notes from Howard Hughes to Chester. And they repeatedly said, Chester, I don't want to buy these assets. Make sure they get written off. And he would sign it HRH, and he tended to sign HRH with a circle around it. So I thought, holy smokes, this is absolute gold mine. This is going to be really important to our case. So we were also having trouble with the depositions of the Hughes people and others, because people getting their deposition taken after what happened to CW1 and 2, they weren't exactly cooperating. So John Clark decided we're going to take Howard Hughes's deposition. Well, Chester was furious, and he wrote to the federal judge Zerpeli in San Francisco that Howard knew nothing about the disputed accounting issues. He called them accounting mumbo jumbo, and the deposition of Howard was harassment to his client. So his depo was noticed in May. He didn't show up. His deposition was again noticed in October, and he did not show up. Now that's a big problem, and John Clark played that to the hilt. He moved for a default judgment in the case, and there was going to be a hearing in Judge Zerpeli's courtroom. Let's see. I've already explained all of this, so I don't need to go into that further. I've talked about this because I was thinking I would like to try to finish fairly close to 8 o'clock. John demanded Hughes's deposition. Chester professed, and he sent an affidavit prepared by Howard that basically said, I don't know anything about these accounting adjustments, and I'm perfectly happy to show up for my deposition if there can be something, some evidence that I had anything to do with the accounting adjustments. Well, that was a fatal error. So Clark then filed a motion for summary judgment when Howard failed to appear for his second deposition. Now, John had hired a handwriting expert because all we know is I've got copies of my work papers with all these blue handwritten notes written by somebody to Chester, signed HRH. And then after I was to testify about the documents containing Hughes's notes, which demonstrated an intimate knowledge about the improper accounting adjustments. They also demonstrated a complete disregard for the purchase agreement and the requirements that the accounting adjustments be using the same accounting principles as was used in the July 1st, 1968 financial statement. So these were killer documents. So when the first work paper with HRH's notes written on it was introduced at the hearing, Chester Davis jumped to his feet and he made 2 arguments. One, the documents had been stolen from his client's office, and it therefore could not be used as evidence in the case. And since the comments were clearly communications to him as Hughes's attorney, they were privileged and could not be used in this proceeding. Now, notably, these arguments were an admission that the comments were communications from Howard R. Hughes to Chester Davis. And I mean, it was wonderful that he made these objections because he validated that these were written by Howard Hughes and they were written to Chester Davis. And the comments themselves demonstrated a clear understanding of the accounting issues and belied Howard's affidavit to the court. So Zerpeli told Davis to be seated and stated that he had a question for me. And he said, Mr. Regan, how did you obtain this document? Because I had a whole box of them and they were going to be introduced. I said, Your Honor, the document was delivered by the U.S. Postal Service in an unmarked box with other similar documents. There was no indication who sent the box to me, and I still don't know who sent the box of these documents. I did not learn until a conversation 5 years later that the CIA had with another attorney, one of John Clark's partners, called one day and said, "Hey, I bet you guys have been dying to find out how Paul Regan got those documents." And they told the whole story, that the DOJ was upset with Hughes, and that they stole the documents, etc. So anyways, Zerpeli asked for a 20-minute recess. And incidentally, this is Chester. And he's leaving in a car from the trial involving where Mayhew was suing Hughes and Chester. He was a piece of work. Just a short story about Chester. Hughes was accused of giving B.B. Rebozo $100,000 to give to Richard Nixon, and as a bribe. And in the Watergate hearings, Chester was called to testify about the $100,000, and he walked into Sam Irving's committee hearing with a briefcase, and he opened the briefcase and poured out $100,000 on the table and said, "You've been asking about the $100,000. Here's the $100,000 that was never delivered to Richard Nixon." So that was kind of the way Chester operated. $100,000 in 1970, it's worth at least $1 million today. So upon return from the recess, Zerpeli made the following rulings. There was no proof that the box or its documents were stolen. Basically, Chester just said they were stolen. And I know, because I've researched it, the reports with the LA Police Department, and also reports in the New York Times and the LA Times. Hughes, they did call the police when the burglary was discovered, because their security guard was tied up and some cash had been stolen. But they understated the cash by a whopping amount. And they also said they could not identify the documents that were stolen. Well, they knew they couldn't identify them because the Zorian documents were top secret, and the Air West box should have been produced years prior. And then Zerpeli said the comments by Hughes to Chester were instructions to Chester, acting in his capacity as Hughes's business agent. Therefore, they were not privileged communications between Hughes and his counsel. Now, I always applauded Zerpeli for, he made that decision in 20 minutes. And I see these claims of privilege that go on in some of the litigation that we're familiar with. And they go on for months and months and months. Zerpeli was quite a character. He was a very decisive man. And so he permitted my testimony to continue. And my testimony explained that Hughes clearly understood the accounting. The result, I traced them in his comments into the adjustments that saved Howard millions of dollars. They were not consistent with generally accepted accounting principles and violated the purchase agreement. So on January 15, Zerpeli ruled that Howard's deposition was appropriate, and he issued a default judgment in favor of the shareholders. And in today's dollars, he awarded $1.1 billion in damages. And we were exuberant because I started working on this case, and I started working on the Air West issues starting in July of 1968, and had been working on the litigation for over 5 years. And I have to admit, I was a little nervous when they issued the notice to Chester Davis 3 days before the hearing that I was going to be testifying. and a vague reference to what my testimony would be. So I was a little concerned about what had happened to CW1 and 2. And this is Hughes Air West, picture of it. And if you wonder what eventually happened to Hughes Air West, it was acquired by Northwest Airlines, which I think has since been acquired by another airline. So that's my story. I don't know whether there are questions, but if there are and you're willing to stay for a bit of time, maybe we can turn off the mutes, and I'm happy to stick around, and I think I'll stop sharing so we can see everybody.
Super. Thank you very much. Let's see. So Jason, are you okay with kind of monitoring this, or
Sure.
yeah, okay, that'd be great. So I see a couple of chats. I don't know, maybe you can pull them up.
Sure. Let me see here. See if I can do a we do have a question in the chat. I'm trying to see. I don't know if can everybody see the chat?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so or if you want to unmute yourselves too. So the question we have is from Joe. So was the current value 1.1 billion significant to the HRH at the time? Or is it like Elon giving up 1 billion to get out of the Twitter deal and reprice it?
Well, it was a significant part of Howard's resources at the time, because he had given away his interest in the Hughes Medical Foundation. He had also given away his interest in Hughes Aircraft Production Company. So he had his casinos, his land. That was his principal assets. So it was a significant part of his worth at that time. But $1 billion, now people's wealth has gotten to extraordinary levels. I think in large part because the stock market is, in those days, I can't remember what the Dow was in 1970, 72 to 75, but it was probably around 1,000. And even today, with the struggles the Dow has been having in the last 4 months, it's at 35,000. So people's wealth, and when you own stock in Tesla and whatnot, it's just gone crazy.
I have just a quick question. So I did read your book and it was wonderful. The part that I was just, I think people of a certain age who went through that time had no idea what was going on as far as what you're explaining, but we would always be reading about what a strange fellow this was, that he was hypochondriac, that he never wanted to see anybody in some hotel room somewhere. And I found it so amazing that all of these people with from whom around whom he was actually never met him, for whom, right. Yeah, I mean, that's amazing to me that everything happened without actually seeing this, being together with this man in that time period.
It is amazing. Mayu never met him. Chester apparently met him, but not very often. And I always thought from reading all the reports that Howard was pretty much kind of a Looney Tune. And if you watch the movie The Aviator, which precedes this time frame, he was portrayed in large part as a loony person. But I've then discovered that Howard did meet with the Securities and Exchange Commission in connection with the sale of Hughes Tool Company. And when he conducted his worldwide press conference, he was he was coherent. He understood what was happening. And certainly when I got the HRH notes to Chester, he was very coherent in describing complicated accounting issues, which was in sharp contrast with the image that you have of Howard. It was in the press, and as you described, this nut that was isolating himself and was on drugs and a hypochondriac. He certainly understood accounting.
Are you allowed to disclose well, first of all, he had no kids, obviously. So what happened to the wealth? And
yeah, he had no children. He was married to Jean Peters, who's a very successful actress, very beautiful woman. But they divorced in the early 70s. And she had a separation agreement, which was also a non-disclosure agreement that basically provided for her for the rest of her life. She did not get any of his wealth other than fulfilling the separation agreement. He had no kids, really, and that led to huge and lengthy litigation over whether or not he had a will and whether or not certain wills that were found were legitimate. And eventually his estate was inherited because Howard died in 1976, was inherited by a guy named Demas, who was a distant cousin. And lucky for him, he still did have a lot of assets.
Interesting. So there's a couple of other chats on there. I don't know if you can see them. One from Lee Livingston he's in Arizona. When you got the documents, were you aware of the break-in LA?
No. When I got the documents, I found they arrived in my office a bit before lunch. I had a meeting with someone else, went to lunch, came back, looked at the documents. I immediately called John Clark. He wanted me to come up that afternoon, but my firm had a softball team and we had a game. I was the pitcher at Central Park in San Mateo. So I said, John, I'll come up first thing in the morning. And we went up, met, so we were flabbergasted. And one of the things that we did was look to see if there were any reports of a burglary. And Ted Russell, who was one of John's partners, went to their LA office and talked to some of his partners, and they indicated that there had been a report of a burglary, and they got the LA Times article, and it was nondescript. It understated the amount of cash that was taken, and it basically downplayed the significance of any documents that may have been missing. They didn't really even identify that there were documents missing, but that they alluded to the possibility that some documents may have been taken. So we didn't know that this box was part of what was taken from the Hughes, from Romaine Street. And that we didn't learn that until Ted Russell, who was one of John's partners, got a call from the CIA 5 years later. And Ted called me up and said, guess what? And actually, it's probably best that I didn't know at the time.
So Jeannie writes, dumb like a fox. I guess that's true. And Joe Baylock, how did the move to get the mob out of Las Vegas. Work out, wink, wink. Yeah.
Yeah, actually it worked pretty well. And it's amazing, getting the Desert Inn involved Mayor working with Johnny Rosanelli, who was found 5 years later in a barrel in a swamp in Florida. He was a mobster that controlled Hollywood. And also when Howard was acquiring the landmark, Mayhew, the Department of Justice was starting to raise a ruckus over Howard's acquisitions in Las Vegas, and the Teamsters Union had lent a lot of money to the then owner of the landmark, and Mayhew called up Jimmy Hoffa, and they worked out a deal, and Mayhew and Hoffa, together with the Department of Justice, worked out a deal that, yeah, all right, if you bail out the owners of the Landmark Hotel and pay off all the creditors, we'll let you close that transaction, but no more. So that was actually a deal that was struck with the cooperation of Jimmy Hoffa and Robert Mayhew and FBI and the CIA. So they basically did clean up Las Vegas, and they took it from the mob-driven casinos and hotels to basically to today's billion-dollar fabulous facilities that are basically owned by large corporations on the New York Stock Exchange. So it did change the atmosphere, but it was pretty dirty in the process.
Yeah. So I see a second comment, Joe Baylock, second book, he says, oh, wait, I have something else. Joanne Garrison, why do you think the CIA phoned Ted Russell and provide the backstory to the lawyers? Why would they have let you in on what they had done with the break-in and the sub-recovery?
I don't know the answer to that question, and Ted certainly didn't tell me. So I really don't know, other than I think they probably were kind of like the Cheshire Cat. They wanted to finally let us know, how all this came down. There was a secret that they decided they'd finally give up. Now, Ted was also a very gregarious, warm personality. He might have been working on a case involving the government, and somebody might have decided, let's give him a good story. And he was unfortunately later killed in a skiing accident, not long after the call with the CIA. So I don't think there was a connection. I think that was an honest accident.
Joanne also wrote, what happened to Mayhew?
Mayhew won his case, and Chester appealed, and then they settled. They settled with Mayhew. He won a great deal of money, and then he's also had passed away not too long after the case.
Interesting.
So is Chester. So is Howard. It's because all of those characters are now dead that I felt a little more comfortable writing the book.
No
I
kidding.
also got permission from the CIA to discuss, because I just talk at length about Project Azorian, and but they gave me permission to talk about it and I use some of their documents. I mentioned the contract with Hughes and give it a contract number and the date and describe it. And then the illustrations, I think, were helpful to understand how did this all work.
Well, I think it's great though. Jason's probably trying to get us to close up, but I wanted to just tell anyone who is not
Sorry, no rush.
No
Take your
rush?
time. Yeah, no rush.
Okay. Anyone who has not read this book, I highly recommend it. The Forensic, it's excellent and real easy read, even when you don't understand numbers.
Well, one of the instructions from the folks that I was working with in New York was to minimize the accounting. And so there really is not, there's a bare minimum of accounting in this book. I told Jennifer, the California Society of CPAs had me teach a course on my book on Friday, just last weekend. And I had to completely redo the course because now, given I was talking to a bunch of CPAs, I could really go into the accounting issues and the debits and the credits and get into the real details of accounting. But the book does not do that.
Were you a real math whiz early on in school? I'm just curious.
I've always liked math, and I like the process of math. You know, how you use numbers, because you know, if you go back to the definition of forensic accounting, it's to gather and collect evidence and to be able to summarize and present that evidence. Now, accounting, a good accounting system within a corporation is basically a history book of every transaction that company has undertaken. And accounting is an organized structure of those underlying documents that support those transactions. So one of the things that lawyers have learned is that forensic accounting, through subpoenas and document discovery, you can get great evidence about who did what to who when. And when you're getting involved in complex corporate litigation, you know, that's a key, because without the accounting and the underlying documents that accountants collect, you know, we're kind of packers that gather and collect data, and we organize it in fairly similar ways. So it's really a gold mine for how you really get the goods on who did what to who when.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, great. I think we can close up then.
Okay. Oh, what about, I think Joe might have another question.
Oh,
Second book
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, second book.
on Vegas.
Does the computerization of that's Joanne. Does the computerization of accounting make your work easier or more difficult?
Much easier. We get, it's fairly typical in our complex business litigation for us to get several million documents, because we get emails. Sometimes it'll be as much as 300 million documents. And we can using keywords, we can identify and drill down and make determinations. And then if we get also data that connects to those documents, we can sort and manipulate and graph that data. You know, we can do so much more with computerized records than we could in the years before that. It's really helpful, but you have to get the computerized documents and know how to get it. When we were hired by attorney generals in the unfair business practices against Microsoft, the court ordered that they train 3 of my associates in Redmond for 3 weeks on how to search and analyze their databases. And they had to make all our databases available to us. And without that access and the computerization and its capabilities to sort and identify and summarize, we never would have been able to be successful. That case, incidentally, that California got, the resolution was provided $10 billion to California's elementary schools.
Wow. Yay.
Worked out well.
Yeah. Great.
Same
Great.
thing with the in the Great Recession. We worked with Kamala Harris and when she was the Attorney General, and she tells the story, and so do we, that when the Obama administration offered to settle nationwide for about $8 billion against the larger banks that were involved in unfair business practices and lending to people who were incapable of repaying their loans. You know, we got access to data, analyzed it, and told Kamala, no, you don't settle for a piece of $8 billion. So she turned Obama down, and about 9 months later, we had enough data where California got $26 billion.
Yeah. Wow.
That's a bunch of money.
Cool. Yeah, that's great.
And she used that a lot in her campaigns. She didn't give us any credit. She didn't give us any credit, but that's okay.
That's wonderful.
We never would have been able to do that without computerization.
So I think it's Joanne again. She says, in this case, Joanne's an attorney, so I can see her kind of drilling down. In this case, it was important to see that HRH was directing his attorney accountant to conduct improper activities. Can you get any sense of direction from a computer? Why an entry was made the way it was?
Usually, you need to link computer entries to documents, either a memoranda or emails or combination of email attachments, where the parties they discuss the transactions, or they discuss what they want to record. In the Lehman Brothers fraud, which the last time they were able to do the repo 105 transactions, which was the fraud, what they called their fraud, they did it for $50 billion. And we can tie that packaging and that behavior to memos and emails and transactions.
That's really cool. Great. So we're pretty good. Good.
Okay.
Now? All right. Well, this was wonderful and very, very, very interesting, even for non-math people like me. So I really want to thank you for joining us, and thank you so much, Jason, for the recording, and I hope we can get that up somewhere.
Sure,
So,
no problem. I'll check in with Tommy.
thank you.
I'll take care of it.
Okay.
And I'll check in.
All right, Jason, thanks a lot. Take
Thank
care,
you so
everybody.
much.
And
Thank you so much.
I don't know what
Okay.
happened to the Warriors, but I recorded it, and I'll go find out.
Yeah. Yeah, sounds good. Okay,
Bye,
bye.
Jennifer. Take
Thank
care.
you.